The papers were folded in thirds, the way a bank statement arrives. Ordinary, almost bureaucratic. My son set them on my kitchen counter without ceremony, without explanation, the way you leave something you don't want to explain. And when I looked up from the dish towel in my hands, he was already studying his shoes. I unfolded them slowly. Civil complaint sat at the top in bold type. Below it, my full name listed as the defendant. The allegations were written in careful, measured language, but the meaning was plain. Persistent intrusion into their household. Unauthorized presence at a school event involving their minor children. And the phrase that made me set the dish towel down for good. Deliberate emotional manipulation designed to undermine the plaintiff's parental authority. 67 years. I've been alive for 67 years. I buried a husband, raised a son alone, worked 33 years at Millbrook County Library, helping children find the books that would change their lives. I taught my son to ride a bike in a church parking lot. I held his hand at his father's funeral when he was 14 years old. I drove 8 hours through a snowstorm to see him graduate from college because the bus wasn't running and I wasn't missing it for anything. And now my name was on a legal complaint filed by his hand. He was already moving toward the door when I found my voice. "Can you at least tell me what this is about?" He paused without turning around. "Monica explained it in the letter," he said. Then he left. I sat at that table for a long time. The coffee went cold. My beagle, Pepper, put his chin on my knee, and I let him. Outside, the neighbors' children were shrieking on a trampoline with the kind of laughter that doesn't know yet what grief feels like. I read the complaint 3 more times. By the third, I had stopped shaking. It hadn't always been like this. When my son called to tell me he and his wife were expecting their second child, I cried. The good kind of crying. The kind that ambushes you. They were living 4 hours away in Claremont then. I had just retired from the library. My husband Roland had been gone 11 years, and the house in Pembroke where I'd raised my son had started to feel less like home and more like a museum of a life that had moved on without me. 2 grandchildren. I made a decision that felt at the time like the most natural thing in the world. I sold the house and bought a small condo 12 minutes from theirs. Ground floor, 2 bedrooms, a little patio where I planted tomatoes and marigolds. I told my son it wasn't about hovering. I just wanted to be useful while I still could. He seemed glad about it. His wife, Monica, smiled in the way she always smiled at me. Politely, as though I were a guest who kept arriving slightly ahead of schedule. The first year, I told myself things were fine. I watched the grandchildren twice a week while Monica worked late. I brought food when they were exhausted. When Clara started swim lessons, and Monica mentioned offhand they were too expensive right now, I paid the registration without making an announcement. When Felix needed speech therapy and the insurance company was fighting the claim, I heard my son say he didn't know what they were going to do, and I wrote a check for 2 months of co-pays and left it in an envelope on their counter. I didn't frame it as a loan. I didn't attach conditions. I just left it there, the way you leave something for someone you love. I know now that I crossed lines I couldn't see. I know I showed up when I should have called. I know there were moments when I stepped into their house and their life in ways that felt helpful to me and intrusive to them. I am not pretending otherwise. But what I gave with an open hand. The first time Monica asked me to step back, she used the word boundaries. She said it gently. The way you say something you've practiced saying gently. She sat across from me in my own living room and explained that unannounced visits disrupted their rhythm. I nodded. I said, of course, I meant it. After that, I called ahead. I texted before leaving. I waited for invitations that came less and less frequently and then stopped. My son and I used to speak every Sunday afternoon, a habit he'd carried from his college years. By last winter, those calls had thinned to once a month, then sporadic, then almost never. When I did reach him, his voice had a quality to it I didn't recognize. Warm enough on the surface, but hollow in the way of someone performing warmth rather than feeling it. Clara was the one who kept the connection alive. She called me Grandma Addie. She drew pictures and left them rolled up in my mailbox with rubber bands around them. Once she left a note that said, "I put a ladybug outside for you so it can walk to your house." I kept that note under my cutting board. Then came the school play. Clara had been cast as the narrator in her 2nd grade production. A little play about the seasons, nothing elaborate, but she told me about it on the phone in a whisper, like she was sharing classified information. I have the most lines, Grandma, more than anyone. I wrote the date on my calendar in red. I did not receive an invitation from my son or his wife. I told myself that was an oversight. I drove to the school, arrived early, sat in the back row on the left side, and kept my coat on in case I needed to leave quickly. When Clara walked out onto the stage in a white dress, with a cardboard sun pinned to her chest, she scanned the audience with those wide, serious eyes she gets when she's concentrating hard. When she found me, she smiled so big I forgot, for a moment, everything that had been happening between us all. The email arrived 2 days later. My son copied to Monica, written in the clipped and airless tone he'd been using with me for a year. Mom, one of Clara's teachers mentioned you attended her play. We weren't told you were coming. You know we've been working on establishing consistency for the kids, and this kind of unpredictability isn't helpful. Please don't attend school events without checking with us first. He signed it. Take care. Take care. I closed the laptop and went out and deadheaded the marigolds until my hands were tired. 3 weeks later, the legal complaint arrived. I spent the first day in a silence that didn't feel like peace. I moved through my condo, touching things without reason. On the second day, I opened the filing cabinet in my bedroom and pulled out everything I had. 12 years of paperwork. The down payment check from 2019, $42,000, written at this same table, Roland's old calculator beside me. The fertility treatments the year before Clara was born. Monica had cried on the phone and said, "We couldn't ask you to do that." And I had said, "You didn't ask." And I had sent the payment directly to the clinic, $18,000. 2 years of therapy copays that the insurance company had classified as elective. The roof repair last spring that my son had texted me about and I had handled without asking whether he wanted me to. The car, the emergency. None of it documented as a loan. All of it in a folder I had labeled in my own handwriting, family. I sat with those papers for a long time. I didn't cry. I made a list. On the third day, I called Shirley. Shirley has been my closest friend since we served together on the library board. She's 71, has grandchildren in Arizona, and a voice that is blunt and kind at the exact same time, a combination I have never managed myself. When I told her what had happened, she was quiet. Then, Adel, let me make sure I'm understanding this. Your son and his wife filed a legal complaint because you attended your granddaughter's school play. Among other things, I said. She repeated it slowly. Among other things. A pause. Tell me one thing you did that was actually mean. I thought about it. I reorganized Monica's spice rack once without asking. Another pause, then get a lawyer. I almost laughed. Then I did laugh. Just a little, which helped more than anything else had in 3 days. That same afternoon, my son came over unannounced, which I noticed but didn't mention. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who is prepared for a negotiation. He said he hoped we could resolve things without going further. He said he hadn't wanted it to reach this point. He said Monica was at her limit and needed me to understand that. I looked at him. This man who had gripped my hand so hard at his father's funeral that he left marks. Who had called me from the hospital at 3 a.m. saying he didn't know what he was doing, and I had talked him through it step by step, calm on the outside, because someone had to be. You let her speak for both of you, I said finally. That's the part I keep coming back to, not the lawsuit, that you just let her. He flinched barely, but I saw it. I'm not going to keep making myself small to fit into a shape that was drawn without me, I said. I've been careful. I've stayed away when you asked. I've waited for calls that didn't come, and none of it was ever enough. So if this is going to court, then I'll see you there. He left without another word. I sat on the kitchen floor for a while, which is something I hadn't done since I was much younger, but sometimes it's the right height for a certain kind of sadness. The lawyer's name was Dana Holloway. She was direct without being cold, and she read through the complaint with the focused efficiency of someone who had seen worse. She told me the case was weak. The allegations were subjective and emotionally loaded, with no specific evidence of harm that met a legal standard. She told me the financial documentation was significant. She also told me something I hadn't considered. That when a judge sees the amounts involved alongside a request for a no-contact order, the picture looks very different from what the plaintiffs are presenting. They're framing you as a nuisance, she said. The record shows you as the person who paid for their house. It was a gift, I said. I know, she said. That's actually more powerful than a loan. We agreed not to countersue, not to seek reimbursement. We would go in, lay out the truth, and let it carry its own weight. That was all I wanted, not punishment, not a victory, just to not be erased without anyone bearing witness. The night before the hearing, Clara left something on my porch. One of the picture books I'd given her at Christmas, propped carefully against my door. Inside the cover, in her careful second-grade handwriting, "This is still yours too. See." I held that book all night. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. Pale wooden panels, fluorescent light, the kind of silence that has weight. Monica sat beside my son in a charcoal blazer, posture perfect, eyes forward. My son studied the table. His attorney spoke in the smooth, measured tone of someone who had rehearsed his skepticism. He described my behavior as a documented pattern of invasive presence and emotional overreach. He listed my visits, my gifts, my appearance at the school play. He made my love sound like surveillance. When Dana stood, she placed our folder on the judge's desk and said simply, "The court is being asked to issue a legal restriction against a grandmother who attended her granddaughter's school play. We'd like it to hear the full picture of who this woman is." The judge was a woman, perhaps 60, with reading glasses on a beaded chain. She looked up from the papers and said to me, "Ma'am, would you like to say something briefly?" I stood. My knees were steadier than I expected. "Your Honor," I said, "I'm 67 years old. I was a librarian for 33 years. I raised my son alone after my husband died. I gave him and his family everything I had. Not because I expected to be thanked, but because when you love people, that's what you do. I know I wasn't always invited. I know I showed up when they would have preferred I didn't. But there is a difference between intruding and loving, and I won't stand here and let my name be attached to words like manipulation and harm when the most I ever did was care too loudly." I sat down. The judge looked at my son. "Would you like to respond?" He looked up. Something crossed his face. Not quite guilt, not quite grief, but something between the two that I recognized from when he was a boy and had done something he couldn't find the words to explain. "No, Your Honor," he said quietly. She reviewed everything and dismissed the court. 1 week later, the ruling arrived in the mail. The no-contact order was denied. The judge had written, "Insufficient evidence to establish harassment, undue emotional harm, or conduct rising to the legal standard for restriction." The court notes that financial records entered by the defense reflect a long-term pattern of material support which significantly complicates the plaintiff's characterization of the defendant's involvement as unwelcome. And then, plainly, the court encourages both parties to resolve their familial differences through direct communication rather than litigation. There were no celebrations, no one called. Monica sent me a 3-line email 4 days after the ruling, formal, asking me to respect their need for space, referring to Clara and Felix as something to be handled internally, like they were line items on a report. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say that would change what we now all knew about each other. 2 weeks later, I was walking the path around the small park at the end of my street when I saw Clara sitting on the low wall near the drinking fountain, swinging her feet, a library book in her lap. She looked up and saw me at the same moment. She jumped down. "Grandma Addie," she said, then quieter, "I'm not supposed to be talking to you." "I know," I said. She came and stood beside me anyway. We looked at the fountain together. "Do you still have the book I left?" she asked. "It's on my nightstand," I said. She nodded, satisfied. "The play went good. I remembered all my lines." "I know, I was there." She looked up at me. "I saw you," she said. "I'm glad you came." I put my arm around her shoulder for a moment, and she leaned in, and we stood there by the drinking fountain until a car turned down the street, and she stepped back and said she had to go. She went. I stayed. That night I wrote her a letter. I told her she was one of the bravest people I'd ever known. I told her that no matter what happened between the grown-ups, I wasn't going anywhere. I told her that sometimes love has to travel in smaller packages for a while, but it doesn't disappear. I sealed the envelope and left it inside the book on their porch before sunrise. A month later, I received a letter in return. Not Clara's handwriting, my son's. He'd written it by hand, which he hadn't done since high school. The paper was a little crumpled at the top, like he'd started over more than once. He said he couldn't explain how things had gotten so far. He said he'd spent the past few months thinking about one specific afternoon when he was 9 and had a bad stomach flu, and I had sat on the edge of his bed for 6 hours, reading to him out loud, chapter book after chapter book, until he finally fell asleep. He said he didn't know why that was the memory that kept coming back to him. Just that it did. He said he hadn't expected me to fight. He said, "I'm sorry, Mom, I mean it." I read the letter in the armchair by the window, Pepper asleep at my feet. I didn't cry. I just sat there for a long time. I wrote him back 2 days later. Short. I told him I'd heard him, and that was enough for now. I told him to tell Clara her grandmother still believed in ladybugs. Then, in the strange quiet that follows something terrible as it slowly becomes something else, Monica reached out, an email. Careful, no legal language, no careful neutrality. She said she'd spent a long time feeling like she was competing with something she couldn't name. The way the kids ran to me. The way my son's voice changed when he talked about his childhood. The way I always seemed to know what to do when she didn't. She said she hadn't handled that feeling gracefully. She said she wasn't sure she was ready to fix everything, but she thought they could start by being honest with each other. I read the email twice. I thought about the woman who'd sat in that courtroom composed and certain. Then I thought about the woman who'd written this. Tentative, careful, sounding for the first time like someone I might actually know. I wrote back. I kept it short. I said I didn't need things to be perfect. I said I was willing to begin. We met at the park, her idea. Neutral ground. She wore the gray coat she always wore, the one that never wrinkles. I brought coffee in a thermos, enough for 2. We sat on a bench and were quiet for the first few minutes, and that was fine. It wasn't hostile silence. It was the silence of 2 people who have heard each other, trying to find a language that hasn't been used as a weapon yet. She told me she'd been scared. Not of me exactly, but of what I represented. A version of motherhood she felt she could never live up to. I sat with that before answering. I wasn't trying to replace you, I said. I never was, she nodded slowly. I know that now, she said. I think I knew it then too. I just didn't know what to do with it. We didn't hug when we stood to leave. But before she walked away, she said that Clara had been asking when she could visit my house again. She said they were working on it. She thought it would be soon. 3 weeks after that, I sat in the second row of the school gymnasium for Clara's spring choir concert. Folding chairs, programs printed on orange cardstock, children in their best clothes looking terrified and proud in equal measure. My son sat 2 seats to my left. Monica sat beside him. We hadn't arrived together. We hadn't sat apart either. When Clara walked out with the choir, she found my face in about 4 seconds. She waved. Not a polite wave, not a small secret wave. A full, open, arm above her head wave, the kind that means she wanted everyone in the room to see who she was waving at. I waved back the same way. After the concert, she ran to me before she reached her parents. She threw her arms around my waist and held on, and I put my hand on the back of her head, and the gymnasium was very loud, and I couldn't hear any of it. My son approached a few minutes later, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched the way they get when he's working up to something. She practiced that song every single night, he said. She kept asking what I thought you'd think of it. Tell her I thought she was extraordinary, I said. He nodded, then quietly, I'm glad you're here, Mom. I touched his arm briefly. He didn't move away. I walked to my car slowly. The night air had gone cool, and the parking lot lights made everything a little softer around the edges. I thought about Roland, the way I always do at moments like this. How much he would have loved these children. How he would have made Felix laugh until he hiccuped. How he would have called Clara his serious one and meant it as the highest compliment. I thought about the woman I was the morning that envelope arrived, sitting at my kitchen table with a dish towel in my hand, trying to understand how the word defendant had found its way in front of my name. I thought about how close I had come to staying quiet. I'm glad I didn't. Not because I proved something, and not because I won, but because silence would have meant accepting that this kind of love, the school playback row, 50 phone calls, when you were sick, write the check and don't mention it kind, was something to be ashamed of. It never was. It never will be. I drove home with the window cracked, the cool air coming in, the streets quiet. Clara's concert program was folded on the passenger seat. Pepper met me at the door, slower than he used to be, but still there, still glad. Some things you hold on to. Some things hold on to you. The trick is learning which is which, and choosing, even when it costs you everything, not to let go of the ones that matter.